Welcome everyone to today's webinar. Thank you for joining us. We're going to be talking today through estate planning for 2025. As we can see here, we're going to be talking through some strategies for how to deal with some of the changes that we're seeing on the horizon, as well as some of the uncertainty that we're all facing in the market and with just the general sphere that we're seeing across the board. Now, today, we've got a panel of expert speakers that are here to help us today. Our speakers represent the subject matter expertise that's offered across Mariner, specifically around the wealth transfer planning process. Both Scott and Zach here were practicing trust and estate attorneys prior to coming to Mariner. Jennifer is a CPA by training with over 20 years of experience in public accounting. Ben also has 20 years of industry experience, 20 plus years to be specific, of industry experience, and has spent a substantial part of his career working at a large trust company. They work directly with our clients, advisors, and outside tax and legal professionals to help optimize the estate and income tax planning for our clients and the strategies around those. So really happy to have them on board. We'll get right into it. As a note before we jump into things today, as we have this discussion, there is an open Q&A. The conversation we're going to have today is going to be pretty thorough. If you have questions that come through, please feel free to send them into the Q&A and we'll make sure to get to those at the end of the conversation today. Perfect. So to launch in first, I want to talk broadly speaking about how we look at estate planning. So Zach, I'm going to come to you first here. When we're looking at estate planning and specifically Mariner's perspective, how can you explain how we at Mariner view estate planning specifically?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Dylan. At Mariner, we're viewing clients into three core blocks. As you can see on the screen, we're looking at $0 to $15 million of net worth. Second block is $15 million to $30 million, and then $30 million and up. Now, one thing that I think is important to note is that if you're in the $30 million and up bracket or the $15 million to $30 million bracket, you need everything that the $0 to $15 million bracket has and potentially more depending on your individual situation. We're going to talk about the core estate planning documents that everybody on this webinar needs. And then if you're in a taxable estate or close to a taxable estate, you may want to use some of your estate tax exemption. And if you're in the higher bracket, you may want to look at potentially freezing your assets in your estate. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like. Before we move on to the core estate planning documents, when I talk about estate tax, in 2025, each individual has $13.99 million, basically $28 million as a couple, to pass tax-free to your heirs before you start paying estate tax. And later on in our conversation, we'll tell you how and why those numbers will be changing, either for the better or for the worse in 2026. And one last thing to note before we move on to the core estate planning documents. Just because you're in the 0 to 15 bracket or even in the $15 to $30 million bracket doesn't mean that the conversation geared towards the $30 million and up is not important to you. Let's rewind maybe 7 to 8 years ago. Let's say you were a $5 to $6 million net worth family. You inherited $1 million from dad or mom or grandpa, and you heard of a company called NVIDIA, and you decided, you know what, let me just invest $1 million in NVIDIA because I think AI is the way to go. Well, that $1 million is probably now worth, what, $23, $24 million, all in a span of 7 years. All of a sudden, you went from not needing larger advanced estate planning to absolutely needing it and potentially looking at utilizing your exemption. So just because you're in one bracket today doesn't mean you won't be in another bracket tomorrow. And that's really a core focus of us at Mariner, is just because your estate tax is one thing today, think about a potential portfolio appreciation and where that could be 10 to 15 years down the road.
That's great, and and it brings a question to mind. I think I can guess how you'll answer this based on what you've shared already. But let's say you got a client that comes to you and says, "Well, I don't have $15 to $20 million right now. I'm definitely not in that $15 to $30 million bracket, Zach. I don't need estate planning, right?" How would you address that?
Well, Ben will be able to speak to this a little bit later, but I'm going to steal one of his lines. If you don't have an estate plan, your state of residence has one for you. So if you don't have a will or a trust or anything set up, when you pass away, if you have assets in your individual name, your state of residence has a very specific state statute as to how those assets are going to go. So you completely lose control as to how those assets are going to pass down to the next generation. It may go to a kid that you're not super fond of. It may go to an uncle or a brother. It's very state specific. So everybody on this webinar needs some type of core estate planning to avoid it being taken out of your hands. So Dylan, let's talk about what those core estate planning documents are, and I'll touch a little bit on the advanced estate planning, which my panelists will talk about a little bit later. So
That's great.
for a core estate plan, there's basically 5 to 6 core documents that everybody should be looking at. You're looking at a living will, which basically dictates what you want in case of incapacity in a hospital setting, your financial power of attorney, your healthcare power of attorney or healthcare surrogate, which a former boss of mine used to affectionately call the pull the plug document. It's who's basically in charge of making medical decisions if you're not able to, your last will and testament, and your revocable trust. So we at Mariner are big fans of revocable trust. It's not necessary for every single estate plan, but we do view it, especially in these net worth ranges, as something that is essential to everybody's estate plan. The last one you'll see on the standard estate planning on the screen here is deeds to transfer of real estate. If you have property that's in your individual name, you have a revocable trust set up, it just makes way too much sense to be able to transfer that real estate into your revocable trust. Some of the advanced estate planning, which everybody will talk about a little bit later. If you're charitably inclined, if you have big philanthropic goals, there's charitable trusts that you can utilize, life insurance for life insurance trusts, generation skipping trusts, grantor retained annuity trusts. These are all different concepts that as you approach that taxable estate level, if you're looking to make sure that you don't pay 40 cents on every dollar to the federal government, these are all different techniques that we can utilize.
Yeah, that's a lot to be given out to the government. 40 cents on
Absolutely.
every dollar. That doesn't feel too good. So when we're talking about this planning, what are some of the biggest mistakes that you see people make? Let's say we're past the point where, okay, I've accepted, maybe I don't have $15 million, but this is definitely a priority. Where do you see those mistakes most commonly showing up?
Well, let's look at what a common trust outline for a married couple looks like, and then I'll kind of bridge you into some mistakes that we've seen in our careers. Um, if you wanted to basically replace this trust outline with my family, that's what it would look like. So I'm the middle sibling of 2 sisters. My parents are still married. If they had a trust, or their trust might look just like this. So you basically have individual revocable trust, husband and wife. At the first spouse to pass away, you'll basically fund a marital trust. And then there's also what is called a bypass trust or a disclaimer trust. So one thing that is a common mistake that families make is they don't fully utilize their exemption that they're given. So again, $13.99 million this year, 28 as a couple. This disclaimer trust basically sets up so that within 9 months of that first spouse passes, the other spouse can disclaim some or potentially all of the assets passed to form a bypass trust. Now, I like to say that money and mourning don't go well together. There's a lot of emotions tied up in a spouse passing away, a dad or a mom passing away. 9 months is not as long as it seems like, and people tend to forget to disclaim these assets, and we lose the ability to utilize some of this exemption. So skipping down to the next generation, so let's say the surviving spouse has now passed away, you'll see trust split up into thirds for these 3 hypothetical kids, or myself and my sisters, if you want to go that route. Um, what we like to see here at Mariner are lifetime trusts established for that next generation. People tend to think that trusts are asset protected fully, but that's not entirely true. Distributions from a trust can be attached to potential divorce or some creditor claims. If you keep these trusts in trust for their lifetime, you really limit the exposure that your kids may have to those potential marital claims or creditor claims. You may also, depending on your own estate plan, or maybe something your estate planning attorney has talked to you about, is age-based distributions for that second generation. Typically, you'll see a quarter outright at age 35, half at 40, the remainder at 45. That's also a mistake that we typically see that still loses that real creditor protection from, these trusts are now outright. These kids have now inherited all that money, so anything is up for grabs. Talking about the exemption that we've now lost as well, each individual has $13.99 million of generation skipping tax exemption. When you set up trust for your kids, and then when you have grandkids, as my parents now do, they've got two granddaughters. When you have that third generation, you really want to benefit your grandkids. Your kids, okay, fine, taking care of them for our entire lives, they'll be fine. Let me benefit the grandkids. If you're a hockey fan and you were watching the Four Nations tournament a couple weekends ago, the two announcers on ESPN were talking about the grandparent business is the best business to be in. So everybody wants to focus on the grandkids, right? I know my two nieces were with their grandparents 2 weekends ago. It was lollipops and ice cream for breakfast every day. So really, that's where we're looking at. If you don't properly set up these generation skipping trusts, those grandkids are going to end up paying more tax than you possibly could. So when we're looking at Mariner as to setting up these trusts correctly for our clients, we want to pass as much wealth down several generations as we can before any taxes due. So these are the types of structures that you would typically see. Scott, I'm actually going to go to you because you and I are the practicing attorneys in the webinar here. Are there any other mistakes that you've seen clients make that have walked into your office for maybe some document review, or even here at Mariner working with our clients?
Yeah, Zach, this was a really good summary. And I would say about 95% of the clients that we work with that have some measure of wealth have some version of this estate plan. So this is sort of the ideal husband and wife or married couple estate plan. That's the most efficient one. And Zach, you hit on some of the main points, which is not capturing the exemption of the first spouse to die, and then the issues with the downstream trust for the kids. The one other thing that I would mention is if you have this revocable trust, one of the biggest mistakes that we see is people not properly funding it. So the purpose of this revocable trust is to be your main estate planning vehicle. And it's also there to help you avoid the time and expense of probate and to provide privacy. So actually taking the next step to funding this trust is critical, especially if you have property in another state. How would you like to have a probate in your state and an ancillary probate in the other state where your other real estate is located? The revocable trust can help avoid all of that and to streamline the process. So that's what I would add, Zach.
Thanks, Scott.
That's great. Now, we're starting to get in some more advanced estate planning and some strategies. I think getting some perspective as far as where we've been from a tax perspective, where we may be going would be helpful. Ben, would you like to jump in on that and talk a little bit about that?
Sure thing. I think what Zach and Scott just covered, the foundational estate plan, the mistakes we see, that is really something that hopefully everybody on this call today can take to heart, right? The idea of more advanced planning depends on your level of wealth. And as Zach pointed out, we don't really look at it at your level of wealth today. We look at your projected level of wealth at life expectancy. And so I always kind of like to take a step back before I take a step forward. And so the visual that you have on the screen in front of you now is the last 25 years of the federal estate tax exemption. And your estate tax exemption is essentially the amount that you can pass tax-free to individual beneficiaries that you're passing. So I tie back to the year 2002. I will date myself just a bit. That was the year that I graduated from college. In 2002, a married couple had $2 million of tax-free transfer available to them. And anything above that was taxed at the federal level at 50+%. So if you think about it, right? My parents, right? School teachers, they dutifully paid their mortgage over 30 years until their house was owned free and clear. They both put what they could into retirement accounts while they were working, invested that prudently, and it grew over time. And if you think about it, over the lifetime, if you have a free and clear residence and you've done some adequate retirement plan savings, as a married couple, you really could be bumping up against that $2 million limitation. And although I wasn't around when estate taxes were created, that was back in the late 1800s, but I can't imagine that the idea is that my mom and dad, a pair of school teachers, would have to do estate tax planning. And so what we've seen over the past 25 years is these exemptions have gone up, and they've gone up substantially to where we sit today, which, as mentioned before, $13.99 million per person. Why in the world they couldn't have made it an even 14 and make the conversations that I have to have for the rest of this year easier, I'll never know. But at Mariner, we like to round up. So essentially, we have $28 million for a married couple of tax-free transfer. Where a lot of families' eyes go when they look at this kind of chart is 2017 to 2018, right? That's the biggest jump that we see. The exemptions essentially doubled. That was a result of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that was passed in 2017 and made effective in 2018. Now, that Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was passed by a process called budget reconciliation. You're going to hear me talk a little more about that in a minute. Budget reconciliation cannot allow for permanent tax law changes. In fact, the maximum tenure that budget reconciliation can address is a 10-year time period. But when they passed that law in 2017, because this was a reduction in tax that would have been collected, they were not able to find enough offsetting revenue to extend those tax provisions for 10 years. Instead, they were extended for 8, which takes us to where we are today, 2025, with a $13.99 million exemption. Now, at the very end of this chart, 2026, and this is an estimate, you'll see for the first time, these exemptions are set to go down, right? Absent tax reform, the exemptions will go from where they are today, $13.99 million, down to about $7.1 or maybe $7.2 million per person. Now, just to put some math around that, right? For a married couple, that takes you from 28 million of tax-free transfer to just over 14 million of tax-free transfer. If we apply the federal transfer tax rate today of 40% to that, when you wake up, assuming tax reform doesn't occur, on January 1st, 2026, if you're above those exemptions, your estate is now subject to $5+ million more of tax than it was the night before. So if you rang in the new year a little aggressively, 12/31 of 25, going into Jan 1 of 26, that hangover could feel a lot worse if you realized that there was more than $5 million of tax that wasn't there the night before. Now, the next question that we are almost always going to get is, but Ben, what happened in November, right? So early November, election results. Donald Trump wins the presidency, and the Republicans control the House and the Senate. So there's a lot of question, debate, and dialogue out there is, do we see tax reform passed this year that would extend those higher exemptions out for a longer period of time? And the answer to that question is, right now, we really don't know, right? Yesterday, the House passed a budget bill, so it will now go over to the Senate. And it does appear that they are going to have that one big bill designed to address both immigration and tax reform. We will likely see, probably by late April or early May, if we have that one big bill, what the future holds. But for now, we really don't know what tax law will look like in 2026. I would say, personally, there is a probability that those higher exemptions will be extended. But there is at least a possibility that those exemptions will be allowed to sunset. And the reason I say that, Dylan, is this. That Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, what we're trying to extend, there are 217 separate tax provisions contained in that bill. Now, I can't sit here and tell you, I have no crystal ball, which one of those 217 tax provisions are going to be extended, but I can tell you with almost 100% certainty that all 217 will not be extended. So it comes down to which of these tax cuts can be extended and which cannot. And if you think about the platform that President Trump ran on, no tax on tips, no tax on Social Security, no tax on overtime. Those are negative revenue type arrangements that will need to be made up elsewhere. And if you think about how many people are truly affected by the federal estate tax, that number is very, very small, right? So I think that there is at least a possibility that the exemptions are allowed to sunset because they certainly impact many, many less registered voters than some of those other income tax promises that have been made by our president.
That's great. That's a lot. That's a lot, especially when you got questions, right? Because as advisors, as clients, we don't know what we don't know. That's why, I mean, for example, at Mariner, we have so many experts, right? We've got advisors, even in this call, we've got advisors, attorneys, we've got a mix. And trying to get to the meat of, well, okay, the number one question clients are going to have, how does this affect me? Getting perspective on how much some of these budget adjustments may actually impact our clients is important when we're looking at real life examples like we're looking at here. Jen, I'd love to go to you for a minute here. I'd love if you wouldn't mind walking us through a real life example of a family that you've helped walk through these questions of how does this affect me? How do I really understand my estate tax liability, not just of, as of today, but how it could look in the future and how we handle the potential ambiguity there.
Sure, Dylan. Yes, we get the privilege of working with so many families across the country. And for this webinar purpose, we kind of put together a hypothetical case study so you can kind of get the feel of how we work closely with our families. In this hypothetical case, we have John and Jane Smith, both still fairly young in their early 60s. We're kind of anticipating them living out to at least age 90. Currently, around 20 million in their portfolio. We like to be really conservative with our planning, so we put a conservative rate of return about 6.3% annually. Although we know if you're working with one of our amazing Mariner advisors, and I had my quarterly meeting yesterday, that 6% is probably pretty low. So very conservative rates. We have annual living expenses around $100,000. And I really hope my husband is not watching this or we'll be having a budget meeting tonight. Because that's probably also really low for a $20 million estate. But anyways, for this purpose, that's kind of the facts, the settings that we're working with. So as you look at, Ben, if you could switch forward to the next slide. So as we look at their estate where it stands today, and we just saw the history of the estate tax and where we are, about $20 million between Jane and John. If John were to pass away this year, we would assume that Jane would inherit that assets. Right now, you can give unlimited assets to your spouse. So John passes away, they go to Jane. Jane passes away, and you will notice that they are currently, between the both of them, under that lifetime exemption. No estate tax due. And as Zach and Scott and Ben mentioned, as we're working through this, we also have kind of that portability. GST, that generation skipping tax, doesn't port over to the spouse. So as we're working through those documents, we will work through that with each family to make sure that it's protected for grandkids as well. But in this situation in 2025, no estate tax due. So essentially tax-free. But let's say that tax reform doesn't happen. And many of us have been watching, listening, attending conferences this year, keeping a pulse on what's happening. Many of the experts we've been listening to are giving it about a 15% chance of it not passing. And so us losing exemption. So fast forward to that hangover on January 1st, 2026. What happens to John and Jane's Smith's estate today? So we had that 6.3% growth. So over 2025, their estate grew. Again, John passes away, it goes to Jane. Jane then passes away, and you will notice that in 2026, they added a new beneficiary to their estate plan. That new beneficiary was Uncle Sam. They now have a $2.8 million estate tax bill for federal purposes. Many of us live in states that also have a state estate tax. So if you're one of those families that live in a state with an estate tax, that tax bill is going to be even larger. And so, like I said, there's some planning, and we're going to go into that of what we can do. But as we work with families, many of us, as mentioned, we don't like to look at it in a vacuum today. We really like to look at the big picture down the road. I was working earlier this week with a fairly young family, very entrepreneurial, investing and starting a lot of companies. Their net worth is going to grow significantly. We were having conversations, and it was interesting when we projected out the growth over the next 30, 40, 50 years. It was very impactful. And so we did the same thing here with John and Jane Smith. We're projecting out 30 years here. That 6% growth, you'll see the power of compounding for 30 years. That $20 million estate is now $55 million. We don't know what the estate tax rates will be 30 years from now. We don't know what the income tax rates will be 30 years from now. But based on what we know today, we are looking at an estate tax of over $11 million that would be due with John and Jane Smith passing with no planning. And we get this question all the time. I've spent over 20 years helping families minimize income tax and estate tax. And the question we get is, haven't I paid taxes my entire life as I've built this wealth? And the answer is yes, you have paid income tax. Now we have an estate tax to deal with as well. And so we're going to look at some ways of how we can reduce that. There are multiple ways we can get rid of the estate tax. One, we could pass away today while the exemption's high before assets grow. We don't really recommend that strategy. And so there is some different types of gifting, which we'll get through, and planning, which we can do in small amounts, large amounts today, depending upon where your family is, that can really make an impact and hopefully minimize this estate tax.
So taking what Jen just said, right? Those exemptions that I went through earlier, that blue bar chart that we looked at, there's two ways that we can use those exemptions. The first Jen just mentioned and not recommended is you can pass. The second is you can gift. You can irrevocably transfer assets and lock in the exemptions of where they are today. And in addition, any growth on the assets once gifted is also going to be free from estate tax, right? Now, if you rewind back where I was to 2002 when I started the conversation, so John and Jane Smith, let's continue that analysis. They have $20 million. If they both had $1 million exemption in 2002, this is a pretty easy conversation for us to have. John gifts $1 million, Jane gifts $1 million, and they have $18 million left that they could then use to live off of for the rest of their lives, right? I would imagine that they wouldn't have too much heartburn or any sleepless nights by giving away 10% of their total wealth. But fast forward to where we are today, right? $14 million of exemption. So first, John and Jane at a $20 million net worth, they can't give away both their exemptions. They don't have enough wealth. But if we were to focus on just one of their exemptions, right, $14 million, and they made a full gift of that amount, they have now given away 70% of their total net worth, right? So what's happened, especially as these exemptions have got higher, is the structure and design of the recipient vehicle, where we are going to make that gift, has become incredibly, incredibly important. And for married couples, right, the vehicle that has become far and away the most popular is something called a spousal lifetime access trust. And in estate planning, we have stupid acronyms for everything. This one is called a SLAT. In a SLAT, one spouse, let's just say John, is the grantor. He is the person that creates the trust. And he's going to gift up to his exemption amount, $13.99 million, into that spousal lifetime access trust. Now, going back to what Zach said earlier, in that spousal lifetime access trust, we're going to have all the right structure and control and trustee selection, ultimately for John and Jane's children and subsequent generations behind them. All of that's contained in the document. However, in addition to that, and in many cases, even before those children or grandchildren are eligible for a distribution, Jane either is a beneficiary of that trust, or as I kind of prefer to see these documents written, Jane could be added as a beneficiary to that trust at a later date, right? So now we've done the estate tax planning to capture the higher exemption that we had today. We've removed $14 million from their estate. We've taken that concern about sunset and a $7.1 million exemption off the table by doing gifting now. All of that wealth, $14 million, and all future growth, and I'm going to show you what all future growth looks like in a minute, will never be subject to federal estate tax, nor state estate tax for that matter. However, if we've miscalculated, if John and Jane end up spending a little bit more like Jennifer and Zach, more than $100,000 a year, or if John or Jane has major medical expenses later in life that require deployment of capital, the trust that we've set up to do the estate tax planning, the trust that's for the kids, can make a distribution out to Jane as a beneficiary of that trust. And this is important. As long as John and Jane are still married, she can share that distribution with John on a completely tax-free basis. Now, if they are no longer married, right? One is they can't share it on a tax-free basis, and two, she's probably not going to want to share it with her ex-husband anyway. So having a happily grounded marriage is an important part of a consideration of this specific estate planning strategy, right? But in a way, we get to have our cake and eat it too. We've done the planning. We've tried to reduce the estate tax liability in the future, but we've created a safety net, if you will, a back door, where these funds could be returned to that spousal beneficiary for use as a couple later in life. So I'm going to add some math to what Jennifer showed you earlier. This was her final slide. This is John and Jane at life expectancy, no planning. This is the slide that I encourage our families to think about the most. This is what your life looks like down the road, right? We're not concerned about today's assets and today's exemption. We're concerned about our projections at life expectancy based on inputs that you have given us. So this is our baseline plan. And as Jen mentioned, the federal government gets nearly $11.2 million. What we built into this model is what if? What if John made a gift into a spousal lifetime access trust for Jane in 2025 using his full exemption? What does that do to the amount of tax paid and the amount of wealth that's left for their children? And the numbers are somewhat staggering, right? This gray box in the upper right-hand part of the screen, that is our spousal lifetime access trust. That is $14 million plus 30 years of growth on that asset. It gets us to over $46 million of wealth. And as we've talked about in this presentation, this amount will go tax-free to their heirs, right? Now, we didn't bankrupt Jane. She still has $12 million left in her estate at the end of her life. But the way we look at the exemptions is when they go down, or if they go down to 7.1 million, they do still get adjusted every year for inflation. So if no tax reform occurs and we have 30 years of inflationary adjustment on those exemptions, by the time we get to Jane's death, that exemption has now gone back up where it's greater than $12.2 million. So what's left in her estate also passes tax-free to her children. So by doing some planning now in an uncertain time, 2025, we have increased the amount of wealth that goes to their heirs by almost $14 million, and we disinherited almost everybody's least favorite beneficiary, which is Uncle Sam.
That's great. That's great. So this is a fantastic tool. This is really wonderful to see. When we're looking at the structure of these and some of the considerations, one of the questions that comes to mind, especially with some of the tax questions that we're coming with, and it sounds like the answer should be pretty direct here, but does a wait and see mentality make sense with this, or is it easy enough to adjust these types of plans and these types of tools to be able to accommodate even a high level of uncertainty?
Yeah, it's a great question, Dylan, and one I get a lot, right? If you're in that $30 million plus bucket, this is a full-time job and we're moving forward, right? If you're in that $0 to $15 million bucket, this might not be a discussion that we need to have right now. But if you're in that $15 to $30 million bucket, that is the group that I do feel is going to say, well, Ben told me earlier in the presentation that it's a probability and then there's a possibility. Let's just wait and find out. If we don't get clarity on what this actually is going to look like till the end of the year, and you've done nothing between now and then to prepare, and you try and make a phone call to a trust and estate attorney on, say, December the 1st of 2025 and say, hey, the exemptions are going down, I'm ready to get started. One is they're not going to take you on as a client. And two is, even if they would, you're not going to have the requisite amount of time to do what needs to be done in order to facilitate that transfer by 12/31. So I was on a call earlier today with a family, and I'm going to tell you all exactly what I told them. We should we should continue to move forward, right, with drafting of legal documents, with execution of those documents, with the opening of accounts that would receive a gift. If we're going to be gifting assets like real estate or privately held business interests, we should start reviewing the operating agreement so we know what the rules are around transferability. If that real estate has debt on it, we should begin a conversation with those lenders to understand the debt covenant and what they would require for us to gift those assets. We should move forward as if we are going to act before 12/31, right? At the end of the day, some families may decide when we get clarity around tax law not to move forward. However, if we find out that the exemptions are going down and we do need to take action, by taking those requisite steps between now, the end of February, and whenever that indefinite point in time where we get true tax clarity, we are going to be ready and prepared to jump if we have to take action. We're not going to be at the end of any attorney's line, nor are we going to be stressed to make decisions in a very narrow window of time when we may not be thinking our most clearly and make the best choices for our family. So I would say act as if these exemptions are going to go down. We don't have to make any irrevocable transfers until we know for sure, but let's follow that old Boy Scout motto and be prepared. Be prepared for what the future holds.
That's great. You can always make adjustments, but if you don't have the planning and all the time-consuming elements handled ahead of time, you won't have an option at that point.
You got it.
That's great. Now, Scott, I want to come back to you as well, because it's been a minute, and I don't want you too lonely over there. We're talking about essentially vehicles to manage gifts and to manage tax burdens. Is there a more manageable way, in your estimation, your expertise, to make gifts during life in order to minimize estate taxes and pass wealth directly to heirs?
Yes. So Dylan, in this slide, we see that standard married couple estate plan that we learned about earlier in the presentation. And then we see this dividing line. And on the right side of that line, we see this black box that says ILIT. And, Ben just went through a spousal lifetime access trust. So, this is just showing a trust that this family created that is not includable in their estate. So this could just as easily be this SLAT, spousal lifetime access trust, that Ben was just talking about. But right now we want to talk about what is an irrevocable life insurance trust. We call it an ILIT. And again, I'm dating myself, but back when I graduated from law school, the estate tax exemption was much, much lower than it was today. And quite a number of people actually had estate tax exposure. And one of the most common techniques that people use to minimize that estate tax was setting up an ILIT. And there's really two main reasons why you would want to do this. if you have an existing policy that has a significant death benefit, $1, $2, $3 million or more, creating an ILIT is a great way to get that policy out of your estate for estate tax purposes. So the number one reason is if you have an existing policy that's in your estate, consider creating an ILIT to get it out of your estate. Whenever you talk about life insurance, I always tell clients that you need to have a specific reason for getting life insurance. The second reason is, again, if the estate tax exemption goes down, or if you have a closely held business in your estate, or if you have a lot of real estate and you have estate tax exposure, sometimes life insurance can come to the rescue to pay your estate taxes. So what am I talking about? Imagine you get hit by the proverbial bus and you have estate taxes that are due. You know, as Ben and Zach mentioned, estate taxes are due 9 months from the date of death. You do not want to do a fire sale of your closely held business or your real estate in order to pay those estate taxes. This is where you can also create a life insurance trust that will step in and pay those estate taxes at your death. And, you know, if you are looking at funding that life insurance trust with a policy, you can make smaller payments to pay those premiums by using your gift exclusion, your annual exclusion. So that's what Dylan was talking about. Is there a way to make smaller gifts to a trust as opposed to one large lump sum gift? And an ILIT can function in that way as well for the premium payments. So on the next slide, we can see, again, that the state that we were talking about, that Jennifer talked about, that Ben talked about. But what if these clients created a life insurance trust? And again, at the second death, Jane's estate, you see the number there, but they got almost $10 million out of their estate by creating that life insurance trust. And that estate tax number went down from about 11.2 million to 8.8 million. And the amount that the kids are getting is increased by $4 to $5 million. Now, I know what you might be saying. These numbers are just astronomical and I cannot get my head around them. But you know, if you look at the power of compound interest, this is actually very, very realistic. But even if your estate is half this size, you can still kind of do the math about what is my estate tax exposure and what do I want to leave for my heirs. So as we come to a close on this final slide here, I just want to point out, can you go to the next slide, Ben?
Yeah, sorry.
You know, we've been talking about John and Jane Smith, this hypothetical client. And yes, the numbers that we saw are quite large, and your situation is unique. Your family is unique. Your appetite for estate taxes is unique. Your appetite for complexity is unique. And the message that we want to leave you with is that what you need to do is look at what your goals and objectives are for your family and what you want to accomplish. And then reach out to your wealth advisor to see what options are available, right? What level of complexity are you comfortable with? Should you go ahead and do that pre-planning that Ben talked about, just in case, right? All of those things, we can help you look at that. So as we come to a close, Dylan, are there any other questions?
Oh, there's lots of questions. It's been good. We've got currently 21 questions in the hopper. So we've got a few to go through.
We have 14 minutes, so we should be able to tackle these.
Yeah, we got some time. So we're gonna go through some of these questions. As a note, we're gonna do our best to get to as many questions as possible. If the questions are too specific around your specific situation, of course, we're not going to be able to answer those live on the webinar. But as a reminder, I would encourage anyone that's participating in the webinar today, one, thank you for joining us first and foremost. But if you're a Mariner client and you have questions beyond what we're able to get into today during this Q&A, we would encourage you to reach out to your advisor and speak with them. Obviously, they'd love to hear from you, and we'd love to hear from you. If you're a guest, and this is your first time, or you're a repeat visitor here, and you've got questions and you don't have an advisor, we'd encourage you to reach out to us. Just go to mariner.com and you can contact us directly on the website. So let's jump into the Q&A here. lots and lots of questions. And if you have questions that you're thinking about, feel free to submit them here. One we actually had come through multiple times was around how state residency impacts estate planning. Not to get too specific because the nuances, depending on how you guys want to answer this, could get vast. But let's say you establish an estate plan and then you move to states. What is some of the main considerations that you need to take into account there? Are there important considerations to take into account there?
I could take the first swing at that. So one is, if you change residency, you should absolutely have all of your estate planning documents updated to be reflective of your new state. To be totally honest with you, trusts and wills, the differences in state by state are not substantial, but on your medical directives, your medical documents, the healthcare power of attorney and the living will that Zach shared, those are documents that do have rather substantial state by state differences. So you want those to be updated to reflect your state of residency. Now, the other component to that, because we've got a lot of people, Jen mentioned, there's 12 states in the District of Columbia that have a state level estate tax, right? And that tax is typically applied to residents of those states. So you'll have people in a state, say like Washington, where they have a $2.2 million give or take exemption, try and move to a state like Arizona, where I live, and there's no state estate tax, to avoid that state level taxation at passing. However, most, not all, but most of those states that have a state level estate tax will continue to look at any real property that you own in that state. So in my example, if the couple from Bainbridge Island decides to move to Scottsdale, but they keep their $5 million home in Bainbridge, they still have a state estate tax liability in Washington, and they may not know that. So simply moving to an Arizona or to any other state without estate taxes is not going to absolve you of that liability. Frankly, I think that's where we as advisors earn our keep, is helping families that we work with think through whether it's a change of residency for tax purposes or otherwise, and still to evaluate where we may have a future liability because of real property that we own elsewhere.
Great. Anything anyone wants to add there?
Dylan, I'll add something on the change of residency. And Ben mentioned that most wills and trusts, state laws aren't going to be too much of an impact. The benefit of a revocable trust is you can change it as often or as frequently as you want. So if you move from a Washington to Florida, where I am, you can go into a Florida estate planning attorney's office, amend that revocable trust to make sure that it reflects Florida laws. There may be specific provisions to your new state that you may want in that trust, and you can amend it, you can restate it. So you can make these changes as frequently as possible. So these trusts specifically, the revocable ones, are not set it, forget it, I can't do anything about it. You can go in and change it as often as you want.
That's great. A couple other questions that came in as far as the necessity of an estate plan. For example, where do you draw the line between, well, I've got, beneficiaries set up on my accounts, or I've got transfer on death paperwork set up. Where are those most beneficial versus jumping into full estate planning to shelter assets? And where do you draw the line?
Dylan, I'll take that one since it relates to what I said earlier. What I did say earlier was one of the biggest mistakes people make is not properly funding their revocable trust. I've actually seen people create a very well thought out and expensive estate plan, but it's completely a moot point because they haven't titled their assets properly. In other words, almost all of the assets flow outside the estate plan because of beneficiary designations and how accounts and real property are titled and styled. So again, asset titling is really important. And it is so important to capture that first spouse's estate tax exemption. I think one of the other questions was, what exemptions can you lose if you don't do that? You can lose the generation skipping tax exemption if you just rely on spousal portability. So making sure you capture that first spouse's exemption is so important, and asset titling, making sure your assets flow through your estate plan, is the way to do that.
That's great. And then along the lines of the flowing of the assets through the estate plan, we had talked a little bit about the gift exclusions, quite a bit about gift exclusions. How would you say, when you're looking at a taxable estate specifically, how does utilizing that annual gift exclusion really benefit? Does it really make a difference in the long run?
The annual gift exclusion is $19,000 this year. And, if you have a 20, 15, 20, $30 million estate, how big of a deal is $19,000? I worked with a client not too long ago where we went through all of these higher level gifting techniques, SLATs, ILITs, the acronym soup just keeps on going, and they just kept rejecting every single one of them for various reasons. And then we started looking at, well, if you were to do gifting, tell us about your family. It turns out, they have 4 kids, they're all married, they have multiple grandchildren, and once we did the math, they could get, quite a sum of money out of their estate by giving every one of those people the annual exclusion gift. And then if you showed them, if you do that for 10 years, your estate tax liability is either substantially diminished or gone. So it's actually possible to move the needle quite a bit with that annual exclusion giving.
And Dylan, that's where the inclusion of the life insurance has an impact. I met with a client who told me he wasn't doing it because he didn't think there was impact to doing the $19,000 a year. And we went to our insurance team at Mariner, and they're wonderful. And we had him run a second to die policy on our client and his spouse if they were just to use annual exclusion gifts for their 2 daughters. And when we came back and we told him what the death benefit was, you could physically see him shift and say, well, that is impactful, right? So I agree with Scott. The use of annual exclusion gifts is important, but how we use it is equally important because they certainly can have an impact, especially if done repeatedly over time.
Yeah, and Ben, even outside of the ILIT, if you have a taxable estate or you've worked with a Mariner advisor and projecting out a taxable estate in the future, there are big bites of that apple that we can do. And we talked about the ILIT and the SLAT, but utilizing that $19,000 annual exclusion is the little bites on the margin that will make a big impact over time to dwindling down that taxable estate as well.
That's great. Now, we spent a lot of time talking about spouses, families, and a number of the questions that have come through is, well, what if that's not me? What if I don't have a spouse, I don't have kids, and I'm looking more at, say, with this one, actually, we had a number of people submit this specific question is, I've got nieces and nephews, I've got siblings. How does that situation impact the way I need to be structuring my estate planning?
I can start on this one. And we work with a lot of families in that very, very similar situation. And a lot of those families do want to benefit nieces, nephews, sometimes even, former employees who have helped them establish the business of how they've got so wealthy. A lot of them also have a charitable intent as well. We get a lot of questions around the charity piece. I would say it's the same planning as your kids. Let's take a step back. Let's look at what your goals are. Let's look at the big picture and see if it's annual exclusion gifts now. Maybe instead of a SLAT, it's just an irrevocable trust for your nieces and nephews that we establish at some level today. It doesn't have to be the full exemption, but all that appreciation gets out of your estate. We can work with you closely on your goals of how you want to assist your nieces and nephews. What do the distributions from the trust look like for them? We work with a lot of families that want it geared more towards like education or buying a home or specific things. They don't want just full access. And so we'll look at that, but then we can also throw a charitable piece into that as well. And that's part of the benefit of doing the planning now, because a lot of the charitable pieces, by doing some of the charitable planning today, we can get the income tax deduction today while you're alive and save on the estate taxes on the back end. And there's different types of trusts that we can utilize that could benefit charity and nieces and nephews, either, established when you pass away or today. So there is a lot of similar planning that we're doing. And again, it's just looking at how you want to thoughtfully pass that down and how we thoughtfully use our exemption today. I don't know if
I'll add, when we're talking about non-lineal descendants, right?
Mhm.
So not kids and grandkids.
Yep.
To me, sometimes the structure of how we leave wealth to our siblings or to our parents is even more important, right?
Yeah.
So I've had this come up before. I'm going to leave, 50-50 to each of my two siblings. Great. What do you think about your two sister-in-laws? I hate them, right? Well, if you leave 50-50 to your two brothers just directly, their estate plan is going to dictate where their wealth
Yeah.
goes when they pass. And their estate plan probably says, I'm going to give everything to my spouse, right? So your money ultimately is going to end up with your sister-in-laws, who you just shared with me are not your favorite people in the world. So why don't we create a trust structure that benefits both of your brothers while they're alive, so they could benefit from that wealth? But at the passing of your brothers, let's irrevocably earmark that money to go down to your nieces and nephews along that line. That way we keep your sisters-in-law, plural, out as part of the estate plan. So there's certainly, as Jen mentioned, tax planning that we can still do for those types of families, but sometimes it's the flocking and tackling around the form and function of their actual documents that add the most value to ensure that the people that they want to benefit are the ones that benefit, and those that they do not want to benefit from this wealth are purposefully excluded.
And it sounds like, if I'm going to put it in a different perspective, that a lot of the estate planning that we're talking about is simply a vehicle to allow for the intent of the wealth to carry on after you're no longer there to control it, to make sure that everything you've been working for, all the goals you've had, the impact you want to have for your friends, your family, charities, whatever, that those wishes and that intent is continued to be honored in a way that is structured and legal and isn't going to be eroded by Uncle Sam or any other uncles that aren't supposed to be getting their hands on the money.
Exactly.
Dylan, you just answered the question of what is a good estate planning result.
Mhm.
A good estate planning result is an estate plan that passes your wealth to your heirs in a way that helps them and doesn't harm them, and in the most tax efficient way possible.
That's beautiful. And I think that's a great place for us to end for today. So thank you, everyone. Ben, Zach, and Jen, Scott, thank you so much for lending your expertise and taking the time to be here today. Again, for all the people who are participating in the conversation and sent in your questions, thank you for that. Thank you for being here. If you have any questions, again, please reach out to your advisor. If you don't have an advisor, please reach out to us at mariner.com and we'd be happy to have a conversation. Other than that, please enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll see you all soon.